For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition has existed in popular memory as a symbol of unchecked cruelty, religious fanaticism, and mass terror. Images of dark dungeons, relentless torturers, and endless executions have become almost inseparable from its name. Yet at the same time, surviving court records suggest that executions were fewer than commonly imagined, that legal procedures existed, and that some accused individuals were acquitted or reconciled rather than killed. This contradiction raises uncomfortable questions. If the Inquisition was uniquely brutal, why do its own archives sometimes tell a more restrained story? If it was merely a product of its violent age, why has it become history's ultimate shorthand for oppression? And perhaps most importantly, why has the Spanish Inquisition overshadowed other, equally harsh judicial systems of early modern Europe? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. The Spanish Inquisition did not emerge in a vacuum, nor was it the first institution of its kind. Long before Spain established its own tribunal in 1478, inquisitions already existed across medieval Europe. These earlier inquisitions, sanctioned by the papacy, were designed to identify and correct heresy, particularly movements such as the Cathars and Waldensians. What made the Spanish version distinctive was not its basic purpose, but who controlled it. Unlike earlier inquisitions that answered primarily to Rome, the Spanish Inquisition was placed under royal authority. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile sought papal approval, but once granted, the institution functioned largely as an arm of the Spanish crown. This political dimension would shape everything that followed. Spain in the late 15th century was a society emerging from centuries of religious coexistence and conflict. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived side by side for generations under varying degrees of tolerance. However, the Reconquista, culminating in the conquest of Granada in 1492, fundamentally altered this balance. Religious unity became closely tied to political stability. The monarchy viewed religious difference not simply as a theological problem, but as a potential threat to state cohesion. This context is essential because it reframes the Inquisition not as a sudden eruption of irrational cruelty, but as a tool used by a centralizing state attempting to define identity, loyalty, and authority. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the Spanish Inquisition involves its primary targets. Contrary to popular belief, the Inquisition did not initially focus on Protestants, witches, or foreign enemies. Its earliest and most intense scrutiny fell upon conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure or coercion. Many of these converts continued practicing Jewish customs in private, either out of conviction or cultural habit. From the crown's perspective, this created an invisible internal division, outwardly Christian subjects whose inner loyalties were suspect. The Inquisition's purpose, at least officially, was to identify insincere conversions and enforce religious conformity. This raises an important question. Was the Inquisition driven primarily by religious zeal or by anxiety over social trust and political loyalty? Some historians argue that the fear of false converts reflected genuine concerns about religious unity. Others point to economic resentment. Many conversos were successful merchants, financiers, and administrators, and their prominence bred suspicion and hostility. Inquisition trials often coincided with moments of economic tension, suggesting that religious prosecution and social competition were deeply intertwined. Official explanations emphasized spiritual purity, but the broader social context tells a more complicated story. The legal structure of the Inquisition further complicates its reputation. Trials followed a standardized procedure, complete with written charges, witness testimony, and opportunities for confession. Accused individuals were often unaware of their accusers' identities, a practice that modern audiences find deeply unjust. Yet within the legal norms of the 15th and 16th centuries, secrecy was not unusual. Torture, frequently cited as evidence of unparalleled cruelty, was regulated and used less frequently than popular imagery suggests. In many cases, torture was authorized only after preliminary evidence was gathered, and it was subject to limits, at least on paper. This does not mean the system was humane. Detention could last for months or years, reputations were destroyed, and the psychological pressure to confess was immense. Even acquittal did not always mean restoration of honor. Property could be seized, families stigmatized, and social standing permanently damaged. Still, when compared to secular courts of the same era, which often used harsher methods and offered fewer procedural safeguards, the Inquisition appears less exceptional than its legend implies. This contrast forces us to reconsider why it became uniquely infamous. Public punishments, particularly the auto de fe, played a central role in shaping the Inquisition's image. These ceremonies, often described as mass executions, were highly theatrical events designed to reaffirm religious authority. While some ended in death sentences carried out by secular authorities, many involved public penance rather than execution. Participants might wear symbolic garments, recite confessions, or accept prescribed punishments. The spectacle reinforced the power of the church and crown, sending a clear message about the consequences of deviation. Over time, these dramatic rituals became the most enduring visual memory of the Inquisition, overshadowing the less visible bureaucratic reality behind them. Numbers are another area where myth and fact diverge sharply. For centuries, estimates of Inquisition victims reached into the hundreds of thousands, or even millions. Modern archival research paints a different picture. While thousands were certainly prosecuted and punished, executions appear to number in the low thousands over several centuries. This does not diminish the suffering involved, but it does challenge narratives of industrial-scale killing. The persistence of inflated figures reflects how historical memory can be shaped by ideology, polemic, and later political agendas. The role of the Protestant Reformation in shaping the Inquisition's reputation cannot be ignored. Protestant writers in Northern Europe portrayed Catholic Spain as uniquely cruel and backward, using the Inquisition as a symbol of Catholic tyranny. This narrative served political and religious purposes, reinforcing emerging national identities and moral superiority. Over time, these portrayals solidified into a broader Black legend, depicting Spain as exceptionally intolerant and violent. While rooted in real events, the legend selectively emphasized Spanish abuses while minimizing or ignoring similar practices elsewhere in Europe. Yet focusing solely on exaggeration risks swinging too far in the opposite direction. The Spanish Inquisition was undeniably coercive. It enforced conformity through fear, restricted intellectual freedom, and contributed to the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. Its long-term effects included cultural stagnation, suspicion of innovation, and the silencing of dissent. The fact that it operated within legal frameworks does not absolve it of responsibility for these outcomes. Understanding the Inquisition requires holding two truths at once. It was neither the omnipresent engine of mass murder of popular imagination, nor a benign or misunderstood institution. As the Inquisition evolved, its focus shifted. By the 16th century, it turned its attention toward Protestants, mystics, and intellectuals influenced by humanism. Books were censored, ideas scrutinized, and boundaries of acceptable belief tightly policed. In this phase, the Inquisition functioned less as a response to hidden religious minorities and more as a guardian of ideological conformity. This transformation reflected broader European anxieties about religious fragmentation, authority, and social order during an age of upheaval. What emerges from this examination is not a simple verdict, but a layered understanding. The Spanish Inquisition was shaped by its time, its political context, and the fears of a society struggling to define itself. Its reputation, magnified by later propaganda and cultural memory, tells us as much about those who remembered it as about those who lived under it. The tension between myth and fact is not accidental. It reflects the way history is used to explain, justify, or condemn. And this leads us back to the central question. Was the Spanish Inquisition uniquely monstrous, or has it become a symbol that absorbs broader anxieties about power, religion, and violence? The answer lies somewhere between denial and exaggeration. To understand it fully, we must continue tracing how it operated, how it changed, and how its legacy was shaped long after its tribunals closed. As the Spanish Inquisition matured, its procedures became increasingly bureaucratic, and this evolution itself is revealing. What began as a response to perceived religious instability slowly transformed into a permanent institution embedded within the machinery of the Spanish state. Tribunals were established across Castile, Aragon, and later Spain's overseas territories. Each tribunal followed standardized rules, maintained detailed records, and reported to the Suprema, the central governing council in Madrid. This administrative consistency challenges the popular image of the Inquisition as chaotic violence driven by irrational zeal. Instead, it functioned with paperwork, regulations, and legal continuity, which raises an important question. Can a system be methodical and still be deeply oppressive? The relationship between the Inquisition and the monarchy is crucial here. Although often imagined as an instrument of the Church, the Spanish Inquisition was in practice an extension of royal authority. Inquisitors were appointed with royal approval, funded by the crown, and frequently aligned with state interests. When inquisitorial actions conflicted with royal priorities, the monarchy intervened. This dynamic suggests that religious enforcement was inseparable from political control. Orthodoxy became a marker of loyalty, and deviation was interpreted not merely as heresy, but as potential disloyalty to the state itself. This fusion of religion and politics becomes clearer when examining who benefited from inquisitorial prosecutions. Confiscated property from convicted individuals often flowed into royal coffers or funded the institution itself. While not every trial resulted in confiscation, the financial incentives were real and documented. Critics at the time, including some clerics, warned that economic motives could distort justice. Their concerns highlight internal debates within Spanish society, reminding us that the Inquisition was not universally supported, even among Catholics. Another commonly misunderstood element is the role of denunciations. The system relied heavily on voluntary accusations from the public, encouraged by sermons that framed denunciation as a religious duty. While this created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, it also reflected broader early modern practices. Similar mechanisms existed in secular courts and other religious institutions across Europe. However, in the Spanish context, where religious identity was tightly bound to social survival, denunciation carried especially heavy consequences. Silence could be interpreted as complicity, while accusation could serve as a means of self-protection or personal vendetta. This ambiguity complicates the moral landscape, revealing how ordinary people became entangled in the system. The experience of the accused further exposes the gap between myth and reality. Prison conditions varied significantly. Some detainees described relatively humane treatment, while others endured isolation, uncertainty, and psychological pressure. The lack of knowledge about charges or accusers was often more damaging than physical punishment. Confession, even without torture, was incentivized through promises of leniency, which blurred the line between voluntary admission and coerced compliance. In this environment, truth became secondary to conformity, a pattern common in many early modern judicial systems. Torture, perhaps the most enduring symbol of the Inquisition's cruelty, demands careful examination. Archival evidence confirms its use, but also reveals constraints. Torture was theoretically limited in duration and severity, and repeated sessions required authorization. It could not legally draw blood or cause permanent injury. These regulations were not always respected, but their existence complicates claims of unchecked brutality. Importantly, torture was not unique to the Inquisition. Secular courts across Europe employed similar or harsher methods, often without the same procedural oversight. The question then is not whether torture occurred, but why the Inquisition's use of it has come to define its entire legacy. Part of the answer lies in visibility. Inquisitorial records survived in remarkable detail, providing modern historians with extensive documentation. Secular courts, by contrast, often left fewer records. This archival imbalance has shaped historical perception. Where evidence survives, scrutiny follows. Where records are scarce, abuses fade from view. The Inquisition's transparency, unintended as it was, paradoxically ensured its infamy. The targeting of specific groups also evolved over time. After the initial focus on conversos, attention shifted to Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity after the fall of Granada. Like the conversos, Moriscos were suspected of secretly practicing their former faith. Inquisition trials against Moriscos intensified in the late 16th century, coinciding with rising fears of Ottoman expansion and internal rebellion. Religious suspicion merged with geopolitical anxiety, transforming spiritual conformity into a matter of national security. The eventual expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609 reflected this fusion of fear, policy, and identity. Intellectual life did not escape scrutiny either. As Renaissance humanism spread, Spanish scholars found themselves navigating an increasingly narrow corridor of acceptable thought. The Inquisition maintained indexes of prohibited books, monitored universities, and investigated scholars whose ideas appeared to challenge orthodoxy. Figures like Fray Luis de Leon, imprisoned for translating biblical texts into Spanish, illustrate how cultural control operated. Yet even here, the picture is nuanced. Spain continued to produce significant literature, art, and scholarship during the Inquisition's reign, suggesting that repression was uneven rather than total. This unevenness extends to geography. The intensity of inquisitorial activity varied by region and period. Some tribunals were more aggressive, others more restrained. Political circumstances, local elites, and economic conditions all influenced outcomes. This variability undermines the idea of a single uniform inquisition operating with identical severity across centuries. Instead, it functioned as a flexible instrument, adapting to changing priorities while maintaining its core purpose of enforcing conformity. International perception further shaped the myth. As Spain's imperial power expanded, so did hostility from rival states. English, Dutch, and French writers portrayed the Inquisition as evidence of Spanish moral corruption. These portrayals circulated widely through pamphlets, plays, and later historical works, embedding a particular image in European consciousness. Over time, the Inquisition became less a historical institution and more a symbol representing everything that Enlightenment thinkers opposed: intolerance, superstition, and authoritarianism. Enlightenment critiques intensified this symbolic role. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu cited the Inquisition as proof of the dangers of religious authority unchecked by reason. Their arguments were powerful but often selective, emphasizing the most extreme cases while ignoring broader context. This selective memory was not accidental. The Inquisition served as a cautionary tale, a rhetorical tool in debates about modernity, freedom, and the separation of church and state. Yet within Spain itself, attitudes were complex. Some contemporaries defended the Inquisition as a necessary guardian of social order. Others criticized its excesses and called for reform.
These internal debates challenge the idea of a monolithic society uniformly terrorized into silence. Resistance existed, though it was often cautious and limited. The very fact that reform was discussed suggested that the institution was neither omnipotent nor universally accepted. As centuries passed, the Inquisition's power waned. Political priorities shifted, intellectual currents changed, and external pressure mounted. By the 18th century, its activities were increasingly anachronistic, clashing with emerging Enlightenment values. When it was finally abolished in the 19th century, it left behind not just records of trials, but a legacy shaped as much by memory as by fact. This brings us closer to the central tension. The Spanish Inquisition was real, coercive, and damaging, but the version that survives in popular imagination is a product of centuries of reinterpretation, exaggeration, and symbolic use. To understand it, we must examine not only what the Inquisition did, but how and why its story was told the way it was. Only then can we begin to separate myth from historical reality. By the 16th century, the Spanish Inquisition was no longer the aggressive force it had once been, but its presence still shaped behavior, speech, and thought. One of its most lasting influences lay not in the number of trials or executions, but in the culture of caution it fostered. People learned to self-censor, to avoid theological speculation, and to keep unconventional opinions private. This kind of invisible pressure is harder to measure than public punishments, yet it may have been far more effective. It raises an important question. Was the true power of the Inquisition exercised through violence or through the quiet reshaping of everyday behavior?
This cultural effect becomes clearer when examining education and intellectual life. Universities in Spain did not collapse, nor did learning disappear, but scholarship increasingly operated within carefully defined boundaries. Theology, philosophy, and natural science were permitted as long as they did not challenge established doctrine. When ideas from abroad entered Spain, they were filtered, adapted, or sometimes suppressed. The Inquisition's censorship mechanisms were not designed to halt all intellectual exchange, but to control its direction. This selective openness explains why Spain could produce figures like Cervantes and Velázquez while still restricting theological debate. Creativity survived, but it learned where not to look. The Index of Prohibited Books is often cited as evidence of extreme intellectual repression, yet even here, the reality is more complex. Many books were banned temporarily, revised, and later permitted. Others circulated clandestinely despite official prohibition. Enforcement varied widely by region and period, and local officials often lacked the capacity or will to fully control private libraries. Still, the existence of the index sent a powerful signal. Knowledge was not neutral, it was something to be monitored. Over time, this reinforced a culture in which caution outweighed curiosity, particularly in areas touching on religion or politics. The experience of scientists and physicians further illustrates this tension. Spain did not reject science outright, but it approached innovation conservatively. Medical and astronomical works were scrutinized for theological implications rather than empirical accuracy. When scientific ideas conflicted with Scripture, accommodation was sometimes possible, but outright contradiction was not. This placed Spanish intellectual life at a disadvantage compared to regions where debate was more open. Yet it is important to note that similar constraints existed elsewhere in Europe. The difference lay not in the existence of censorship, but in how centrally and symbolically it was enforced. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond Spain itself. As the Spanish Empire expanded, inquisitorial tribunals appeared in the Americas, where they adapted to colonial conditions. In these territories, the Inquisition focused less on indigenous populations, who were often deemed outside its jurisdiction, and more on European settlers and converts.
This distinction is revealing. The goal was not universal enforcement of faith, but the regulation of those considered full members of Christian society. In the colonies, as in Spain, the Inquisition functioned as a boundary-making institution, defining who truly belonged. Colonial records show that inquisitorial activity in the Americas was generally less intense than in Spain. Executions were rarer, and trials often centered on blasphemy, bigamy, or forbidden books rather than heresy alone. These cases highlight another overlooked aspect of the Inquisition, its role as a moral court. Many prosecutions addressed everyday behavior that violated religious norms. In this sense, the Inquisition resembled other early modern institutions concerned with regulating morality. What distinguished it was not the type of offenses, but the symbolic weight attached to its authority. This symbolic power helps explain why the Inquisition endured as a cultural reference long after its practical influence declined. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers increasingly viewed it as a relic of superstition. Spain itself began to feel the pressure of international criticism and internal reform movements. Some officials argued that the Inquisition hindered economic development and intellectual progress. These critiques were not abstract. They were grounded in comparisons with other European states that appeared more dynamic and innovative. Gradually, the Inquisition became associated not with stability, but with stagnation. Political changes accelerated this shift. As absolutist monarchies evolved and secular administrations expanded, the need for a religious tribunal diminished. The Crown, once the Inquisition's greatest supporter, now saw it as an obstacle. Its abolition was not the result of a sudden moral awakening, but of changing priorities. The state no longer required religious uniformity as the primary foundation of loyalty. National identity, bureaucracy, and law could serve that function more effectively. In this sense, the end of the Inquisition reflects broader transformations in how power was exercised. Yet even after its formal abolition, the Inquisition continued to live on in memory and myth. Literature, art, and later cinema fixed its image as the embodiment of cruelty and fanaticism. These representations were powerful precisely because they simplified. The complexity of legal procedures, regional variation, and historical context disappeared, replaced by a single emotionally charged narrative. This simplification served moral and political purposes, particularly in societies defining themselves in opposition to religious authority. It is here that the phrase, "nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," gains its ironic power. The joke works because the institution has become a symbol divorced from its historical specificity. It represents arbitrary authority, sudden punishment, and irrational power. That this image persists tells us something important. Collective memory often values symbolism over accuracy. The Spanish Inquisition became a shorthand for fear, even when other institutions produced comparable or greater suffering. This does not mean the suffering caused by the Inquisition should be minimized. Lives were disrupted, families were destroyed, and communities were fractured by suspicion. Fear of accusation could poison relationships and undermine trust. These human costs are real, even if they do not align neatly with exaggerated numbers or dramatic myths. Understanding the Inquisition requires acknowledging this harm while also resisting the temptation to turn it into a caricature.
The question of intent remains central. Did inquisitors believe they were doing good? Contemporary writings suggest many did. They saw themselves as guardians of truth, saving souls rather than destroying bodies. This mindset does not excuse their actions, but it helps explain them. The danger lies in systems that allow certainty to override empathy, procedure to override justice, and unity to override diversity. The Inquisition exemplifies how institutions can commit harm while operating within a framework of sincere belief.
This realization pushes us toward a broader understanding of historical responsibility. The Spanish Inquisition was not an aberration isolated from its time. It reflected fears shared across Europe: fear of disorder, fear of fragmentation, fear of losing control. Similar mechanisms appeared wherever states sought to enforce ideological unity. The Inquisition stands out not because it was unique, but because it was so thoroughly documented, remembered, and repurposed. As we approach the final phase of this story, the central tension becomes clearer. The Spanish Inquisition exists at the intersection of myth and reality, history and memory. It was neither the monstrous engine of endless death nor a misunderstood institution of mere legal order. It was something more unsettling, a system that normalized coercion in the name of stability and whose legacy was shaped as much by later storytellers as by its own actions. Understanding that legacy requires one final step: bringing myth and fact back into dialogue. As we reach the final layer of this story, the question is no longer simply what the Spanish Inquisition did, but why it continues to occupy such a powerful place in historical imagination. Few institutions from the early modern world are remembered so vividly, and even fewer are remembered so selectively. The Inquisition has become a moral reference point, invoked whenever authority appears absolute or belief is enforced through fear. This symbolic afterlife is not accidental. It reflects the needs of later generations to find clear villains in a past that was, in reality, far more ambiguous. One reason the Inquisition endures as a symbol is that it sits at the crossroads of religion, power, and violence. These are forces that societies repeatedly struggle to reconcile. When Enlightenment thinkers sought to define themselves against religious authority, the Inquisition provided a ready-made example of what they opposed. When modern states promoted freedom of thought, the Inquisition stood as a warning from history. In each case, complexity was sacrificed for clarity. The institution was flattened into a lesson rather than examined as a historical process. This flattening has consequences. When the Inquisition is portrayed as uniquely evil, it obscures the broader landscape of early modern justice. Secular courts across Europe executed far more people for crimes such as theft, vagrancy, and witchcraft. Religious persecution was not limited to Catholic countries, nor was ideological conformity enforced only by churches. Protestant states expelled minorities, censored ideas, and punished dissent with equal severity. Yet these systems rarely occupy the same place in popular memory. This imbalance raises an uncomfortable question. Are we remembering the Inquisition because it was worse, or because it was more useful as a symbol? At the same time, pushing back against exaggeration must not become an exercise in rehabilitation. The Spanish Inquisition inflicted real harm. It criminalized belief, institutionalized suspicion, and legitimated coercion in the name of unity. Its victims were not statistics, but individuals whose lives were permanently altered. Families lost property, reputations, and security. Communities learned to fear difference. Even when executions were rare, the psychological toll was profound. These realities remain, regardless of how myths have grown around them. What makes the Inquisition particularly instructive is how ordinary it was in some respects. It relied on paperwork, procedure, and routine. It did not require constant violence to function. Instead, it embedded fear into everyday life, encouraging self-regulation. People learned what not to say, what not to read, and what not to question. This kind of power is subtle, and for that reason, more difficult to confront. It reminds us that oppression does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it operates quietly through habits and expectations. The longevity of the Inquisition also matters. Institutions that last for centuries inevitably change. The Inquisition of the late 15th century was not the same as that of the 17th or 18th. Its priorities shifted, its intensity fluctuated, and its social role evolved. Yet popular narratives often treat it as static, frozen in its most extreme moments. This tendency reveals how historical memory prefers simplicity over duration, moments over processes. Understanding the Inquisition requires resisting that impulse and accepting contradiction. There is also the question of responsibility. It is tempting to blame the Inquisition on a handful of fanatical inquisitors or manipulative rulers, but institutions endure because they are supported, tolerated, or normalized by societies. The Inquisition was sustained by popular participation, whether through denunciations, compliance, or silence. This does not mean its victims were responsible for their suffering, but it does suggest that coercive systems rarely operate in isolation. They draw strength from fear, conformity, and the desire for belonging.
Looking back, the Spanish Inquisition becomes less a story about medieval cruelty and more a case study in how societies respond to uncertainty. Spain in the 15th and 16th centuries faced rapid change, religious diversity, political unification, imperial expansion, and economic strain. The Inquisition promised order in a world that felt unstable. It offered clear boundaries in place of ambiguity. That promise was powerful, and it explains why the institution was accepted for so long, even as its costs became apparent. This perspective brings us full circle to the question of myth versus fact. The myth of the Spanish Inquisition exaggerates its violence, simplifies its motives, and isolates it from its context. The facts, when examined closely, reveal a system that was bureaucratic, inconsistent, and deeply embedded in its time. Neither version alone is sufficient. The myth obscures understanding, while the facts, stripped of moral reflection, risk indifference. True historical insight lies in holding both together. So, when we ask whether the Spanish Inquisition was as terrible as its reputation suggests, the answer is neither a simple yes nor a comfortable no. It was terrible in its consequences, even if not always in the ways popularly imagined. Its cruelty lay less in numbers than in normalization, less in spectacle than in endurance. It reminds us that harm can be systematic without being chaotic, and that legality does not guarantee justice. Returning to the questions we began with, the contradictions remain, but they are clearer now. The Inquisition was not history's greatest killing machine, yet it became history's most powerful symbol of repression. Its archives do complicate the darkest legends, but they do not erase suffering. Its procedures were orderly, but their purpose was control. Its legacy was shaped as much by later fears and ideologies as by its own actions. In the end, the Spanish Inquisition forces us to confront a deeper truth about history itself. We often inherit stories that are morally satisfying rather than analytically accurate. Challenging those stories does not weaken our condemnation of injustice. It strengthens our understanding of how injustice works. The Inquisition was not a monster outside history. It was a product of human choices made under pressure, justified by certainty, and sustained by fear. And that may be the most unsettling conclusion of all. As we move toward the end of this story, it becomes clear that the Spanish Inquisition cannot be understood solely by counting trials, executions, or years of operation. Its real significance lies in how it reshaped behavior, memory, and identity long after its courtrooms fell silent. Institutions fade, but mental frameworks endure. The Inquisition taught generations of people how to think about authority, belief, and safety. That lesson proved remarkably durable.
One of the most revealing aspects of the Inquisition's legacy is how rarely it needed to act in order to be effective. By the 17th century, the threat of investigation was often enough. People learned to internalize its expectations. Conversations became cautious. Religious practice became performative. Intellectual curiosity learned to disguise itself. This kind of power leaves little physical evidence, yet it may have been the institution's most effective tool. Violence creates resistance, but predictability creates compliance. This raises a crucial point often lost in popular depictions. The Inquisition did not rule primarily through chaos or terror, but through normalization. It established clear boundaries and enforced them consistently enough that most people learned to stay within them. In that sense, it functioned less like a constant storm and more like a permanent climate. Daily life adapted around it. Fear became routine rather than explosive. The persistence of the Inquisition's image also reflects how history assigns symbolic weight. Other early modern institutions committed comparable abuses, yet they rarely occupy the same moral space. Witch trials in Protestant territories claimed tens of thousands of lives. Secular courts executed criminals at far higher rates. Colonial administrations inflicted systematic violence across continents. And yet none of these have become cultural shorthand in the way the Spanish Inquisition has. This imbalance suggests that memory is shaped not only by events, but by narrative usefulness. The Inquisition became useful because it could be framed as the opposite of modern values. As Europe moved toward Enlightenment ideals of reason, tolerance, and free inquiry, the Inquisition served as a convenient counterimage. It embodied what society believed it had overcome. In this role, historical accuracy mattered less than moral clarity. The Inquisition was turned into a warning sign, stripped of nuance and frozen at its worst. But simplification carries risks. When history is reduced to caricature, it becomes easy to distance ourselves from it. The Inquisition appears as something alien, something that could only happen in a superstitious past. That comfort is deceptive. The deeper lesson of the Inquisition is that people were not cruel then, but that systems of certainty can override empathy in any era. The danger lies not in medieval theology, but in institutions that reward conformity and punish doubt. This is why the Inquisition still matters. It demonstrates how fear can be organized, how morality can be bureaucratized, and how violence can be justified without appearing chaotic. It shows how institutions can claim to protect society while quietly narrowing its boundaries. And it reminds us that legal procedure on its own is not a safeguard against injustice. The Inquisition followed rules. The harm came from what those rules were designed to achieve.
It also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about participation. The Inquisition did not operate in isolation. It relied on denunciations, cooperation, and silence. Many people never encountered it directly, yet adjusted their lives around it. This does not imply collective guilt, but it does challenge the idea that repression is always imposed solely from above. Systems of control endure because they offer incentives, safety through compliance, belonging through conformity, protection through silence. At the same time, resistance existed. People concealed books, practiced forbidden customs in private, and quietly tested boundaries. Some officials resisted excesses. Some intellectuals found ways to think around restrictions. These acts rarely appear in dramatic narratives, yet they reveal the limits of institutional power. Even the Inquisition could not fully control belief, curiosity, or memory. Its authority was real, but never absolute. By the time the Inquisition was formally abolished in the 19th century, it had already lost much of its relevance.
The world it was designed for no longer existed. Political authority had shifted. Religious uniformity was no longer the primary foundation of loyalty. Ideas traveled faster than tribunals could follow. The institution lingered, not because it remained effective, but because institutions often outlive their purpose. What survived more powerfully was the story. The Spanish Inquisition became a narrative vessel, carrying centuries of anxiety about power, religion, and coercion. Each generation reshaped it to reflect its own fears. For Enlightenment thinkers, it represented superstition. For modern audiences, it symbolizes authoritarianism. In popular culture, it became a punchline, a dramatic trope, a warning from history. And yet, when we strip away both the exaggeration and the defensiveness, what remains is something more unsettling than myth. The Inquisition was not uniquely monstrous, but it was deeply instructive. It shows how ordinary people, convinced they are defending truth or stability, can participate in systems that cause profound harm. It shows how fear, once institutionalized, becomes self-sustaining, and it shows how memory can distort reality without erasing responsibility. So, was the Spanish Inquisition a myth? No, it was real, coercive, and destructive. Was it exactly as popular imagination portrays it? Also no. Its cruelty was not infinite, its reach was not omnipresent, and its violence was not unmatched by its contemporaries. The truth lies between denial and demonization. Returning to the questions we began with, the contradictions now make sense. The records do complicate the legend, but they do not redeem the institution. The procedures existed, but their purpose was control. The numbers may be lower than myth suggests, but the psychological and cultural damage was vast. The Inquisition was not history's greatest engine of death, but it became history's most enduring symbol of enforced belief. And perhaps that is why it continues to matter, not because it was uniquely evil, but because it reveals how easily systems built for order can slide into repression, how certainty can replace compassion, how legality can coexist with injustice. The Spanish Inquisition is less a relic of the past than a mirror, reflecting how power behaves when fear is treated as virtue. History rarely offers simple villains. It offers structures, incentives, and choices made under pressure. The Inquisition was one such structure. Understanding it does not weaken moral judgment, it deepens it. And that, ultimately, is what history usually leaves out.